I come from the oldest living culture in the world, and our natural states of being is that my empowerment, my actualization into my gifts and my strength and my dreaming is my responsibility because when I actualize into who I was always meant to be, it allows my children and my community and those that are around me to have permission to actualize into themselves, not by what I do, but by who I am first and foremost.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Welcome to Represented, the podcast. I'm Aniki Shuru, racial equity coach for online business owners who want to be intentionally inclusive by building a business that is racially equitable. I created this podcast to normalize the conversation around racial inclusion so that fear is no longer the barrier that gets in the way of doing this work. This isn't about perfection, it's about progress. Whether you're taking your first steps or you're well-versed in the journey towards racial equity, this space is for you. So welcome home, friend. Let's get started.
From coast to coast, around the globe, we are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
A trigger warning for you, dear listener. In this episode, we are talking about sexual abuse, domestic violence, and suicide. I've just had a 2-hour conversation with Shantelle Thompson. We started talking before I pressed record. We recorded the conversation, this podcast episode, and then after recording, we spent some more time chatting. This is a conversation that could have gone on and on and on, and this is the first time that I'm actually splitting the podcast episode into two. So there will be a part one. This is part one, and then there will be part two next week. And I think it is so fitting, particularly as we head to January 26th. And for those of you who are Australian, you know what that date symbolizes, particularly to our First Nations people. And it is so important for us to be having this conversation, to be amplifying their voices, and to really know how to position ourselves as allies to stand in solidarity with them. But more than anything, it is the hearing of Chantelle's story, the fighter, or should I say the warrior heart that she has and who she is, that comes through so powerfully in our conversation. She is incredibly articulate, so well versed in her area of expertise as a mentor. As somebody who is so connected to country and her bloodlines, this is a conversation that you need to pay attention to, particularly if you're Australian. Just hearing her story and the things that she has had to fight for, and the undoing of the narrative of who she was told or expected to be, and how she has rewritten her story. Now, let me read a little bit of her bio for you, and we can get into the conversation. But I know that this is one of those discussions that will leave you really, really fired up to do something for yourself, your own purpose, to really pursue it. And so, Shantelle Thompson OAM, known as the Barkindji warrior and warrior heart, is a proud Barkindji Ngiyampaa woman, mother of 5 and 3-time Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu World Champion. Culturally grounded, ancestry guided, and dreaming led, Shantelle is on a journey to becoming a black belt world champion while inspiring and empowering others to find their dreaming and purpose. She knows what it means to fight for yourself and your own path, using her story to lead others in reclaiming their identity, culture, and sovereignty. Through her work with the Kilalana Foundation and the Warrior Heart community, Shantelle fights for cultural reclamation, social justice, and equity. As the author of the upcoming book, Warrior Heart, Suicide to World Champion, and host of the Warrior Heart Yarns podcast, she shifts narratives and helps others embrace their truth, power, and the courage to create their own meaningful path. Without further ado, here is Shantelle Thompson. Hey there, everyone. Happy 2025. This is the first episode of 2025, and I am so happy to be back with you here. And today, I am so happy to have Shantelle Thompson with us. A warm welcome to you, Shantelle.
Hi everyone, and thank you so much, Annie, for welcoming me to your platform and to your community and to your work.
When we've known each other for quite a few years, we haven't been connected for quite some time. And so for me I was deep in research and looking for guests, for this year. And when I came across you, and as I wrote in my email, reaching out to you, was listening to your podcast and one of your episodes talking about dreaming. And I honestly felt like it was a yarn we were having, just the two of us. And I felt like you were talking to me. It didn't feel like a podcast. And it just kind of hit home and spoke to things that maybe were just at the back of my mind, but not things that I had really, dug into. I was like, hang on, Shantelle, goodness. This is powerful. And I just felt like I have to have you on the podcast and have a conversation.
And I think that was my intention for my podcast. So I have two podcasts, and one is called Warrior Heart Yarns with Anishan, and it was very much came from my heart that I think most people of color and Indigenous backgrounds will understand this. You have those elders, those aunties, those uncles who you'll have the uncle that or the auntie that loves on you, that when you're going through hardship, they're the ones that hug you, and then you got the ones that will go, they give you that loving slap or that it's time to wake up. Like they're very much that call to responsibility, and they're the ones that when you're around them, like you are standing up tall, you are holding your
Mm.
breath because you're not quite sure what the reception's going to be, but you know that it comes from that love and that calling you in back to your responsibility. So Warrior Heart Yarns was very much me just talking about the things that I felt compelled to share, but those yarns that needed to be had, but you know that they're going to stir things up. So that's why that warrior sort of spirit, like it takes, you need to be grounded to be able to share them. And then Journey to Black Belt is very much about not just sharing my journey through jiu-jitsu and now being a black belt, but it's people who have reached or are on the journey to mastery of their platforms, but they have that samurai spirit to kind of go, I need to master myself in order to be able to do my work in the world. And just on that, as we're getting into this, I just want to stop and take a minute to acknowledge my ancestors and acknowledge the country that I'm on. I'm on Latchi Latchi country, and I'm also across the river from my Barkindji country. And I just want to take a minute to acknowledge my ancestors and my elders for because I have dreaming, I have culture, I have identity because of those who came before me, those who were here before colonial and patriarchal systems and the damage that was done and is continues to be done, but also those who were able to fight and stay strong so that those of us, they brought me here, but it's now my responsibility to pick up that work and take it further. So I just want to acknowledge and pay my respects because who I am needs to honor those who came before. It needs to strengthen and resource those who stand with me. And it also needs to leave a legacy and resources and support the generations to come.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, your heritage, paying your respects, I would love, Chantel, if you could just take us back, and just take us to growing up, being the second eldest of 17 siblings, I believe, to a single parent, a dad, separated from your mother. You've accomplished so much in your short life, may I say. How did you arrive here as a warrior heart? And I know that's a huge question to answer in like a few minutes, but if you could just take us back to some of the things that have shaped you growing up to where you are today.
I think where I really need to start this yarn is that the world tried to write my story for me before I was even born, and there were two stories, there were two narratives that I could choose. And one was the colonial and patriarchal narrative where we almost have to prostitute our trauma and our deficit to justify our success and our rise. So as you said, like as I'm only 41, and I say only 41 because in a Western patriarchal context, as a woman who is in my 40s, entering my 40s, we're aging, right? And it's almost seen as a deficit. Oh my God, like it's a multi-billion dollar industry of imaging, low self-esteem, imposter syndrome, makeup, fashion, all of it in order to fit the rhetoric of aging gracefully and staying young and holding on to your youth. Whereas from an Indigenous matriarchal context, I'm still young. Like I'm in this age where I'm raising the next generation. And I'm still raising myself in that being prepared to take up the mantle of being a matriarch and a leader and an elder when I'm called to that time. So I'm in this emergence, and we are constantly in this emergent stage where we already are who we are and we're serving the season, but we're also being prepared for the season that we're entering into. The second narrative was that I come from the oldest living culture in the world, and our natural states of being is that my empowerment, my actualization into my gifts and my strength and my dreaming is my responsibility because when I actualize into who I was always meant to be, it allows my children and my community and those that are around me to have permission to actualize into themselves, not by what I do, but by who I am first and foremost. So I somehow was gifted the courage and the responsibility to be able to hear the ancestral call of my ancestors of power, of purpose. Or in the Maori, I'm learning a lot about Maori connection and culture is the mana wahine, the power of the woman. And that is the narrative that I chose to rise from, not I refuse to any longer participate in this prostitution of my trauma and my deficit narrative to justify my rise and my power. And that includes my own community's take on that with lateral violence and where genocide and colonialism has taken us away from our power and our responsibility as Indigenous people and women, but also to make the patriarchal and colonial narrative okay, three-time world champion or a six-figure entrepreneur or the warrior heart and the Barkindji warriors because she had to fight. So it woke that up. It was like, no, I was always this person. I just accepted and surrendered and became obedient to the calling. So as I say, I'm culturally grounded, I'm ancestrally guided, and I'm dreaming led. So for those that don't know me, I am Shantelle Thompson. I'm a very proud Barkindji Ngiyampaa woman who also has cultural heritage ties to Irish, Scottish, English, Chinese, and Sri Lankan, but I am first and foremost a First Nations woman. I am a mother. I'm Anishan, and these are the three roles that weave together to ground me in how I show up and who I'm here to serve, and what shapes how I move through the world is my Indigenous culture, is being a woman, is being a mother and an auntie, because that then shows how I show up to serve. And my early beginnings were very complicated in that there was a lot of adverse childhood experiences of sexual abuse, violence, having to be a protector. Like you said, I'm the second oldest of 17 siblings. So I was the oldest at home. I'm the second born to my mum. I'm the first born to my dad. And being born a fair-skinned Aboriginal woman comes with its own complexities because in my head, I always thought I was this brown girl, but then I'd act like that my external features represented um my ancestors, but I have fair skin. So it was very complicated that when I would be myself in the world, people wouldn't receive the image that I had of myself of being a big-hearted person. So the messaging was either that you were too much or not enough. However, through all of the adverse experiences that I had, my parents did the best that they could. And I always had one person that loved me. I also had one person that affirmed me. And I had this courage and this calling that my ancestors were, this is not the place you are meant to stay. It's the place that will shape you, but where you are called to go is not of this time and place. So I knew I was called to become someone, and I knew I wanted to give my children and those I experienced a different experience to what I'd had growing up. So what that led was to all these different iterations and chapters of me trying to find my voice in the world, telling me that it wasn't safe to be myself in the world. So this is where that warrior heart stuff comes in, is that I've always been heart led. And I had to fight to be myself in the world. Like literally, I had to fight my own inner narrative, my trauma, my conditioning, and I had to fight the external world that said, you're not allowed to be that person. You can't be that person, or it's not safe to be that person. So where that has shaped me and led me to at 41 is that I have 3 world titles. I have 3 degrees under my belt. I have made a 6-figure business. I've started the Kilalana Foundation. And yet what it has cost me is that I'm a high functioning achiever. So a lot of my achievements were my trauma manifesting in me proving myself good enough. And look, winning world titles is easy for me. It's my playtime. Jiu-jitsu is my playtime. And I don't say that to take anything away from people who it's their life work to win world titles. But when you look at the work that I'm here to do to heal my own trauma so my children don't become victims of my dysfunction, they become beneficiaries of my strength and my cultural reclamation. I've had to fight to reclaim my culture. I've had to fight to reclaim my story. I've had to fight to create sacred space within myself and my home to find who I am in a world that profits from me not being myself. So I'll weave all that together to say that Shantelle Thompson, the Barkindji warrior, warrior heart, going from suicide to world champion, being a mother of 5, an elder sister of 17, the eldest daughter of my father, is that I have had to fight to be myself in the world, and it has cost me more than what I can share here. I ended a 20-year relationship in 2023 that saw me dance with the depths of my darkness to the point where there are 3 times in this life that I have tried to take my own life, and the ancestors in the world have said, no, you are needed here, and they've pulled me back from those experiences. It has meant that a child of mine has gone no contact because they've said who I am does not benefit them in this world. And ending my relationship actually brought to the surface the domestic violence experiences that I was having. And I had to go and sit with professionals, and I had to navigate the shame and the grief that Shantelle, the Barkindji warrior, was having these experiences. But it was so insidious that I was like, someone like me isn't allowed to have those experiences. I can't frame this as domestic violence because it doesn't look like this over here. I had to go and seek professional help and sit with people who love me and see me. And I'm like, is this really that experience? Like I was gaslighting myself. So where I sit today, the fact that I am still here to even have this conversation is because my ancestors have a purpose and a meaning bigger than myself. I pulled myself from the depths of my darkness, surrounded by those that love me for who I am, because my children deserve better than the legacy of mum killed herself because we weren't enough for her to live for. Like, and I know that that oversimplifies it, but that's my truth.
Mm.
And everything that I have done prior to this season of being the Barkindji warrior was led by this calling that I wanted to do more than survive. And I wanted my children to be, and those that I serve to be beneficiaries of who I am, not collateral damage. And I wanted to call people back to their responsibility to be a part of their own self-determination and sovereignty. And I wanted to shift narratives around powerful women, mothers, Indigenous people, and people who have come from mental health or adversity.
Mm. Gosh, you have shared so much in just that one piece, and there's so much to unpack from that and take in all sorts of different directions. But the thing that has stayed with me as you've spoken is the word fighter. that you are a fighter. And my question is, being the strong fighter that you are, and I have felt it not just uh, just reading it, but with our conversation, listening to the podcast, your writings that I've been researching and reading through, there's a fighter in you. Do you think that one is born a fighter, or that is something that one learns to become a fighter? Because not everybody fights, not everybody has that. And I don't just mean the physical, it's the mental too. Not everybody has that fight in them. Is it inborn? Is it something that people learn?
It's both. I mean, you have the nature versus nurture conversation, and we are both shaped by the world, but we also shape the world that we are in by who we are. And there's a lot of that's why a lot of my experience over the last 12 months, and will continue on for quite a season, I believe, is this idea of reclamation, remembering, birthing, and evolving. And what I mean by that is reclaiming who I always was, but wasn't allowed to be, or that was taken from me, not just for me, but for my mum and my grandmother, because they weren't allowed to be in proud, culturally grounded First Nations women because it wasn't safe to be. And they also didn't take the responsibility to fight for themselves to be that in the world. So, one, they couldn't be, and that's the thing, you look at history, there are people who couldn't be who they needed to be and who they were born to be because of the times of society, and they chose safety or their circumstances didn't allow. And then there were others who stood up and said, no, I'm going to be myself at all costs. And I mean, we only have to look to history: Nelson Mandela, Harriet Tubman, um, uh, um, Kathy Freeman, and other Oprah Winfrey, like all these people who have gone on to change the world. They had to be themselves in their own world first before they became people who changed the world, because they chose to stand up and fight for themselves by being themselves first and reclaiming what was lost, remembering what was, but also being courageous enough to birth what needed to be birthed into the world, but also evolving what already was there. So, yes, our circumstances do shape us and condition us. And I think for me, it's fighting from the heart is I don't know where the saying comes from, but I would think the saying goes, I would prefer to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. And regardless of what people want to say, we are in a war right now. And I think there are times coming, we are at war. We are at war. And you only have to look at the attack on Indigenous rights and women's rights right now across what's happening in New Zealand with Te Reo Māori. How is a country so threatened by having two national languages when that is the first language of that country? You take away the 200 years, the measly. When you come from the oldest living culture in the world, 200 years is nothing, but it's also everything. And I think that's the perspective that we have to take, is that this is everything, but it's also nothing. And women's rights, Indigenous rights are being attacked. What is it about us being in our power that is so threatening to the current status quo, that we and all the problems that we face as individuals, that we have to live with, that we have to fight through, are not of our own making? Like, imposter syndrome is the greatest form of gaslighting that I have ever heard. And that's a whole podcast in and of
Yes.
itself. I do not, it is a tool of colonial and patriarchal systems to keep me in chains. Now, it is not my fault what happened to me, but it is my responsibility to break the chain. So I was born a warrior, and I want to replace the word fighter with warrior because I think it's different. I now know that I grew up fighting because I had no other choice. But I now don't need to fight because I know how to fight. And what I mean by that is, when you have to fight and you're fighting for survival, it can be very dangerous. But when you get to safety, sometimes we don't recognize that we're in safety, and what we use, the tools we use to fight to get us to where we were, can sometimes then become the things that we harm ourselves, that we weaponize against ourselves, because we no longer recognize the need for evolution. So the Barkindji warrior that got me to 3 world titles that got me to where I was at 39 and 40 is not going to serve who I'm called to be next as a global leader and a story maker and an elder in the work that I'm here to do to guide the next generation. So we are shaped by our circumstances, but some of us are born this way because we are called to lead and evolve in a different way. And for me to even be saying that and not have my voice shake shows me how far I've come in my own fight. So there's a book called The Warrior of Light by I always muck up his name, Paulo Coelho, the writer of The Alchemist.
Yes.
And it's in one of the poems, it says, I'm not a warrior of light because I didn't fail. I'm a warrior of light because I never lost hope of being able to do better. It's not that I haven't hurt people that I've loved. It's not that I haven't made mistakes. It's not that I haven't lost integrity. It's not that I haven't done harm. But I'm not going to weaponize my mistakes that stop me from my responsibility to show up. And I've never lost hope of being able to do better. And I'm calling this the dreaming, but also the responsibility, because we have a responsibility to be a part of our own self-determination and sovereignty. And some of us can do better and more than others because of who we are. So I have a Kenyan titter, and for those that don't understand, titter means sister. And Lillian Kukuvi is from Kenya, and my other titter, Gemma Saunders, is a white queer woman. And the three of us wove our callings, our gifts, and our strength together to create a movement called Becoming Better Together, creating cultures of belonging and respect through ancient principles and practices of Kenyan, queer, and First Nations culture. And Gemma introduced me to Kiki. So Kiki is truth telling and yarning. But Harambe is a Kenyan concept of individual contribution to collective purpose. And Lil, if I've gotten that wrong, or anyone from Kenya, and I need to expand that, please reach out to me and let
I'm Kenyan,
me
so
know. But what if I have marked that up? But what I took from that is that who I am as an individual, I need to ensure that my individual contribution is a benefit, is that the collective purpose is a beneficiary of my individual contribution. But my contribution only needs to be what I have to bring to the table. And it's not in comparison to the person who has less than me, and it's also not in comparison to the person who has more than me. If I'm showing up and I'm giving what I have to give and I'm bringing my best, I'm playing my part to weave into the collective purpose. Is that what Harambe is in your, am
yes.
I am I even close to that? Because
You
that's
are
what I took it as, and that's what's moving me forward, and that's what I see being a warrior as.
Yes, you are very, very true definition. Harambe is coming together, you know, it's all about unity. It's all about how can we do this
Mm.
collectively together. It's not about being individual. It's kukuja pamoja, tuungane pamoja. It's coming together. We do it together. It's a collective, and we form a movement in that way. And our second president, Daniel Arap Moi, the late, that was his thing. He used to go and give speeches, and he'd say Harambe, and everybody would echo back Nyayo, like in his footsteps, and that was his nickname, like Nyayo. And so grew up very much in a Harambe kind of motto. And then so with Lillian bringing that through, I think that's really beautiful, and how you've just described it, and how your work, your calling, your purpose, and what the three of you have put together just sounds incredible, and what is so much needed. Chantelle, as I was reading through your work, and I came across a title that said, I fight to break the cycle of Indigenous despair. I was wondering, is that what drew you to martial arts? And if so, is what have the lessons been from jiu-jitsu? It's something that not many people venture into, or even women for that matter, to get into wrestling or fighting or, martial arts. It's something that we look at and we admire, like, oh, that's a strong person. But it's not something that even we as women are encouraged to get in. So, was it that fight to break the cycle of despair in your community that led you there, or was it something else?
Everything that I have been called to do and that has become my community and my family have become beneficiaries of has been because it's been a personal battle that I've had to face where I kind of got to a I think I want to preface that some people like the smell and the feel of their own dysfunction because it serves them. So a lot of my work is that you have people who are stuck in despair, dysfunction, and trauma because that's what they have grown up with. That's all they know. And they don't have the skills or the tool or the sense that they can get out. Then you have the middle group of people who do have the capacity and they do have the sense that they can get out, but they choose not to, whether it's conscious or unconscious, they choose to stay there. And then you've got those of us that kind of weave in, balance in between, back and forwards, where it's like, oh no, I know I need to get out and there's no one coming to rescue me. It's on me. So anything that I have done and anything that I have become is because I got to that crossroads of going, oh, this isn't how things are meant to be, but also I don't want to stay here. So I need to go on and do this work. I need to be the one to do the fight. And then when I've lifted my head enough, I'm like, oh, this is helping my family or this is helping others. So jiu-jitsu has had different chapters for me. When I first found jiu-jitsu at 19, it was because, so I want to preface, I grew up fighting. I am not the type of woman that needed to, I'm not the type of woman that was cowering in the corner or that I've always had power, I've always had fight, and I've always had voice. But when it came to when I was being attacked, I would often cower, I would diminish myself to fit in because when I was sexually abused at 6, there were two incidents that I think my first remembrance of the first emergence of the warrior heart kind of came through, and my warrior was I remember I'd been hurt. I was 6 years old, and it wasn't in the incident that I fought for myself. I pushed back and said no. It was when we'd been found after the incident had happened, and it was actually my mum's sister, and she said, "Be quiet, that didn't happen." And I stood up, and I remember this power in my body. And we often say like little people, big emotions to justify young, like 3-year-old tantrums and things like that, but it's not. That's their world. It's not little people, big emotions. That is real for them. And I wasn't conscious of it at the time, but I that was the first time I remember planting my feet and going, no, that's not my story. Not those words, but that like the first conscious memory. And I called my dad and I told my dad at 6 years old, I spoke my truth to my dad and my dad believed me and my dad came and got me. And but I had to believe myself first. Like my ancestors gave me that strength, but I've had to fight to be myself in the world. I've had to, like I said, I had to fight myself, my trauma, my ego, and I had to fight the world. And the only way I've been able to survive is by being myself and going, I don't know how to be anything other than what I am because I don't have the bandwidth for it. So when it came to jiu-jitsu, I was 19. I just finished school. My final 2 or 3 years of schooling, when I was 15, I had a teacher. I had two teachers. One said to me I was more likely to end up dead or pregnant than I was to finish school because statistics were against me, because I triggered her so much because I wanted more than what my station was allowing for me. It was like, hold on, this is what you're allowed to have. But because I wanted more,
Yeah.
she tried to pull me back down. Then I had another teacher and I pushed back against her and I said, I very colorfully as a 15-year-old. And I said, that's not my story. But then I was still so stuck in my own deficit trauma, my own, I was trying to fight to get out. I didn't know how. I had another teacher who saw my potential, but she couldn't get through to me. And she said to me one day, and I remember the tears in her eyes, and she said, Chantel, you have your head stuck so far up your own behind that you are a part of your own problem. You have all of this potential, but you are getting in your own way. So at 19, I was in nightclubs fighting men. I was getting into trouble, but it wasn't that I was fighting to protect others. I was fighting because I began to enjoy the violence and it began to become destructive rather than a protective factor. And that's when someone said to me, hey, you should go and try this jiu-jitsu thing. And I was like, when I went and saw jiu-jitsu, so for those that don't understand or don't know, jiu-jitsu is a non-striking martial arts. It's a ground-based martial arts. And I want to preface that if you have for people that frame martial arts and competing and stuff as violence, people are safer because of what I've done. I am still alive because of the martial arts, because I channeled my power and my aggression and my trauma into something that could help shape me and could help me take responsibility and own that power and those strength and those experiences. So at 19, jiu-jitsu found me. My ancestors guided me to it. And I was like, what is this? This is rolling around on the ground in your pajamas. Like, this is what I do for fun with my brothers or my siblings. But then something woke up in me. At 19, I was like, this is an arena where I can be shaped. The idea of the samurai, of the self-mastery, of the power. And I learned within my first few lessons that being angry didn't serve me. It was how I focused and the intention. And it was also the calling back to my culture as well, because it was like, hold on, my culture and grounding on country, my dreaming and what does being a warrior and mean for my people, but also as a martial artist. So it was two in the same. It was who did I need to be able to be of service to my community so that um, my work wasn't tainted by my trauma and everything. And then, so that's how I started jiu-jitsu. I was starting off because I wanted to be an MMA fighter. So I haven't shared this story publicly, actually, because most of people know my story with jiu-jitsu as the starting point when I got postnatal depression in 2010 with my twins. And then that started my competing thing. But there's a history before that. At 19, I wanted to be an MMA fighter. I enjoyed fighting. That's the other thing. Most people aren't comfortable with this, is that I enjoyed my power, I enjoyed my fighting, and I found an arena where that was permissible. But then when I took that fight out into the world, it had been honed and shaped in a way that others would be beneficiaries of that. So when I was 19 or 20, I had finished school, I was studying to be a teacher. I knew I wanted to work with young people and I knew I wanted to shift the narratives around being a woman and being an Aboriginal woman. So I set out on this idea. The UFC Ultimate Fighting Championships was new to Australia, was new to the world. I was like, I could be an MMA fighter, I could be a cage fighter. So I was going to move, my plan was at 21, I was going to move from Mildura, where I live, to Melbourne. I was going to finish my teaching degree. I was going to train to be an MMA fighter, and I was going to be a stripper to fund both of those because I already had that entrepreneurial spirit that I was like, I don't want to be in debt. No one's going to pay for this for me. I need to support myself. So I'm going to be an exotic dancer. I'm going to be a stripper because I wasn't scared that anyone was going to touch me because I knew I could handle myself, but also I was grounded in my sexuality. I knew I was beautiful. I enjoyed my body and I knew that. So it's quite funny that that was my first starting point of entrepreneurship, being a fighter, wanting to shift narratives, but understanding in order to shift narratives out there, I needed to be that within myself. And so from there, jiu-jitsu took on. And then in 2019, I had my first daughter in 2022. So I put that dream aside. But in 2009, I gave birth to my twins and I ended up with severe postnatal depression that developed into postpartum psychosis. And I had an incident where I hurt my daughter. And people, if they want to know that part of my story, they can, that's out there on the internet. I share that story. That story was the seed planting for who I was to become next, because I recognized in that moment I hurt my daughter because I wasn't addressing my trauma. So I had to take responsibility. And there were many different pathways, but that was my calling back to jiu-jitsu, and competing became a pathway for my healing, for my actualization. But in the competing, I then became aware of how I was shifting narratives for other people. I was giving other people permission. For context, I started off on the journey to become a world champion, an elite athlete at the age of 27 with three children, coming from a regional community, no sporting background, no sponsors, and never having traveled overseas. So that became my journey to becoming a world champion and the Barkindji warrior because I was suicidal. I had hurt my daughter. I was deeply sick with postpartum depression. And I also recognized my responsibility to do something to help myself. Then all the other sort of stuff kind of was a ripple effect or a flow-on effect from me doing the work to heal myself, to show up for myself first so that I could then show up for my children.
Oh, Shantelle, this sounds like Jiu-Jitsu saved you. It sounds like it was that avenue that took you in the direction that has now really birthed the human, the warrior that you have become. And that brings us to the end of part 1. You must join us again next week with part 2, where this will be very much focused on Chantelle's activism and really talking about January 26th, what that day means to our First Nations people and how we as Australians can stand in solidarity with them. You have to come back and listen to that conversation because Shantelle goes into deeper conversation about not only just what it means to be an ally, but your calling, your purpose, and fear. How you can use fear to get to the other side of what you have been assigned, called to do. Until next week, take care.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a review so this podcast can reach more online business owners, and together we can begin to normalize racial inclusion in the online coaching space. I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where this podcast episode was recorded, the Wiradjuri people in central New South Wales, Australia. Music produced in Nairobi, Kenya by Patrick St. Pimbaru and Kambua Mathu. Vocals by Joanne Matata.
Represented.